Hi, it's Dwyer. It is March the 5th, 2025. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. Let me just say, this forum, for an old timer like me, is really a godsend. Understand what life was like before the internet, before YouTube, before all of these fight films. You would hear about fights, right? Jack Johnson, Jim Jeffries, um, Jack Dempsey, Luis Firpo. You would hear about these historical fights and they would tell you things like they turned the camera off before the end of the Johnson fight. Dempsey got knocked out of the ring, may have had help getting back in the ring, including help from the referee to beat the count. By the way, all of that turned out to be false. How do I know? The video is up here. Right? Jersey Joe Walcott knocks down Joe Louis twice in a fight. Gets robbed. The entire Ezer Charles Jersey Joe Walcott series of fights. Right? I heard about them. Understand. Back in my day, the 70's, the 80's, you didn't even have a VCR. So unless you happen to be watching some old boxing show on network TV and they showed you the fight, you didn't get an opportunity to see it. Now the net has changed all of that, right? You can go back and you can actually look at Ray Robinson as a middleweight. Unfortunately, you're not going to find him as a welterweight. But you can see him as a middleweight. You can see all of these older fighters, right? Jack Dempsey is alive and well. The Jess Willard, Jack Johnson fight, you can find it here online, right? It'll address all of these claims that somehow the outcome was tainted. Well, let me just say, there's a YouTuber, I'm going to give him a shout out. I have the utmost respect. This guy, to me, represents the best of YouTube. He is Rich the Fight Historian. Right? Please look up his videos. He's Rich the Fight Historian. Now, let me just say, he's posted a video that I have put in my favorites folder. I did not see this fight until earlier tonight. Right? I was alive in the 1970s. I'm that old. Right? I know the guys involved in the fight. I did not see this fight. You want to know how good Rich the Fight Historian is? This fight wasn't even televised in the 1970s. This fight has no boxing announcer. Someone with a camera taped the fight from the crowd. And believe it or not, it's now up on YouTube. Now let's give a little bit of history. People think I'm just popping off when I say that today's heavyweight division, you're looking at history, right? Tyson Fury, Alexander Usyk, Anthony Joshua, Daniel Dubois, possibly Vladimir Klitschko again. Then you have a whole list of challengers. You have guys who could be king. You have future phenoms. Moses Atama, how good is he? Let me say, you have sleepers. Right? Joe Parker is mowing down a lot of guys. Ajit Kabayal, how good is he? Right? I'm telling you, and I know the crowd doesn't buy this, Philippe Ergovic is an heir apparent. I'll mention another one here. This is the deepest heavyweight division I have seen. Let me also point out, too, that the money is with these guys. Some of these fights these days are getting more than 70 or 80,000 people. Also, you have pay-per-view that far exceeds closed circuit from the 1970s. The fight that Rich, the fight historian, has posted that I'm going to talk about here only had 5,000 people show up. The fight wasn't televised. Now promoters are savvy. You have free TV, you have online live fights, you have pay-per-view. Right? The guys at the top end, there isn't a lot of money in boxing, but the guys at the top end, particularly in this Riyadh, Saudi Arabian era, are getting huge money. Huge. Let me just say, though, if you're a boxing historian and you're looking at heavyweight divisions, understand every generation believes that their group of guys matches up well. I've heard Lennox Lewis, and he's a great fighter, folks. He'd be great in any era, right? But I've heard Lennox Lewis try to talk up his era, right? He talks about Evander Holyfield. The hardest puncher he dealt with, Shannon Briggs. You had guys like Razor Ruddock back then, Tommy the Duke Morrison back then. Right? You know, people remember the 90s. Of course, you had the tail end of Iron Mike Tyson back then. Right? You had some other guys who on a given night could be very dangerous. Danny Williams. Right? But for my money, the heavyweight era that I witnessed, that's, in my opinion, the second closest to the current heavyweight group, are the heavyweights of the 1970s, right? And understand, they had a distinct advantage over this current group, right? I was watching my TV, and there was Ali against Leon Spinks, right? In the 70s, you would turn on your TV, Foreman against Ron Lyle was on network TV. By the way, you want to know how rinky-dink things were in the 70s? If your copy of that fight has a lot of static for the first 2 rounds of that fight, believe it or not, that's how the fight aired. They couldn't get rid of the static. So if you watch the first round of Foreman-Lyle, classic, you're going to have a lot of static there. Right, so understand, in the 70s, unlike now, where I need a DAZN subscription or ESPN Plus, or I need to come out of pocket pay-per-view, right, to see the truly big fights. In the 70s, I'm just telling you, some of the biggest fights of the decade were on TV. I saw Jimmy Young, in my opinion, beat Muhammad Ali, right? Ali got the decision. I'll agree there's some sketchy parts of that fight that are on par with Lamont Roach versus Gervonta Davis, right? But just understand, Ali was on network TV. You know, people around you, even those not into boxing, they all knew who the heavyweight champ was. I mean, everyone knew who the heavyweight champ was. You knew about the big fights months in advance. We knew about the Rumble in the Jungle before it happened. Right? So let me just say this. I'm going to name some guys from the 1970s just so you fully grasp the era. Right? The top 4, we'll call them. And one of these guys had a problem beating the other guys. But understand, he was good enough where he got to fight the other guys. Right? So let's name the top 4. Frazier. Smoking Joe was hellacious, folks. Right? Ali. George Foreman. And then the 4th guy, Kenny Norton, who got knocked out by George Foreman. Kenny got knocked out by Ernie Shavers. If you recall, Kenny at the end of the 70s, he gets knocked out by Jerry Cooney. But Kenny broke Ali's jaw. Right? Kenny beat Ali at least one of those fights. You look at those fights and you tell me who you think won the series. I'm telling you, in the 70s, many people thought Ken Norton won that fight series. Right? Kenny, of course, beat guys like Jimmy Young. Right? Kenny lost to the era's heir apparent, Larry Holmes. But understand, below these elites, and Larry's really toward the latter part of the 70s. Right? In the early and mid 70s, Frazier, Ali, Foreman, they're kings. You can pick different great fights and ask yourself, is this the fight of the decade? In terms of pre-fight hype, the first Frazier-Ali fight, and that's how we should call it. Right? Because Ali's coming back from Siberia. He beats Oscar Bonavena. I believe he beats Jerry Quarry. Right? Then he ends up in the ring with Joe Frazier. Smoking Joe was the active champion, and he was a champion. Right, folks? The pre-fight hype on that fight, off the page. Frank Sinatra could not get a seat to that fight. So he then got a photographer's license and held a camera while he was watching the fight. I'm not kidding. Right? That's a mega fight. That's a rare fight. Two unbeaten champs. Two Olympic champions with real claims on the heavyweight title. Of course, you have the Rumble in the Jungle. Right? The term rope-a-dope came out of that. The idea that Foreman actually gets knocked down by an Ali who is well into his 30s was shocking. Foreman unbeaten going into that fight. Right? I would argue that Foreman referee count is awfully short, folks. Right? Keeping in mind that Foreman is the heavyweight champion, seems to me that when Foreman gets up, he should still have his title. I'm not saying Foreman wasn't awfully tired. I'm not saying Foreman would be able to go the distance. I'm not saying Ali didn't win some rounds with his back up against the ropes. Right? But let's just say that fight may have stopped a little bit prematurely. Then, of course, you get the Thriller in Manila. Right? Let's just say Ali had one hell of an early part of the 1970s. Right? You had the Thriller in Manila. Open question on whether Ali was ready to come out for the 15th round. Right? In interviews, Ali talks about how he was thinking of throwing in the towel. Right? At the time, we didn't know Frazier was blind in one eye. Right? But let me just say this. Believe it or not, as good as these guys were, right? Frazier, Ali, Foreman, as good as they were, folks, they were tested. The group right below them tested them. Oscar Bonavena knocks down Joe Frazier twice. Right? I mentioned Kenny Norton. Folks, he gave Ali all he could handle. Let me tell you, after the third Norton-Ali fight, the scoring was so controversial that they had Brent Musburger on TV, right, in a future show. And they were critiquing the rounds, right? Because, of course, these shows would, the live fight would be for just the paying customers. Then a week or so later, the network would release the fight to the public. So let's name guys in the other group, right? The guys who did not wear the crown, who made the 70s a great decade for heavyweight boxing. In the comment section for old timers, you know who you are. Mid-50s to, let's say, early 70s, right? Tell us if you consider this to be the 1970s to be the golden age of the heavyweights. Understand, Ali, in a moment of candor, was asked, what would happen if Prime Foreman fought Prime Tyson? And we thought Tyson was a monster in the 1980s. And Ali said that Foreman would win by early knockout. When the interviewer asked him why, Ali explained that Foreman was in against tough competition because of the era Foreman fought in. And Ali's an interesting voice because, understand, Ali predates the 70s. Right? Ali fought Henry Cooper, Sonny Liston, Sonny Banks, Cleveland Williams, Ernie Terrell, Zora Fali. Ali fought many of the big names of the 1960s. And Ali understood that Foreman's level of competition in the 1970s just better prepared him for a fight against Mike Tyson than Tyson's level of competition in the 80s. And there were guys in the 80s who were tough. So let's talk about the 70s here. Let's talk about that other group. Jerry Quarry destroys Ernie Shavers. Right, folks, Quarry is rough and tumble. Right? Quarry was so full of himself in the 60s that he announced that he felt if he had a shot, he would have beaten Rocky Marciano, right? Who was viewed with reverence because Marciano retired in the 50s with the title unbeaten. Jimmy Young. Now, this is an interesting guy because Jimmy Young, if you believe the scores, I'm not sure if I do, but Jimmy Young beats George Foreman. Let's give Young credit for making it to the last round against George Foreman. Right? In my opinion, Jimmy Young beats Ali. Right? Jimmy Young goes the distance against Ken Norton. Jimmy Young was tough. Ernie Shavers. Folks, the closest that Larry Holmes in his prime came to losing, and understand, Larry's unbeaten the whole time until the Michael Spinks fight, if you believe the scoring of the Michael Spinks fight. But understand, the closest Larry Holmes came to losing was when he was on the canvas against Ernie Shavers. And Larry gets up, and I'm just telling you, I don't think Larry knew where he was. Just look at the look on his face. Right? He hit the canvas so hard that when he gets up, Larry can't even fully close his mouth. I'm not kidding. Right? Larry then dances away from Ernie, clears his head. Right? Understand, Ernie Shavers is the guy who Larry feels took years off of Muhammad Ali's life. Right? Larry, who used to be Ali's main sparring partner, claims that Ali was never the same after fighting Ernie Shavers. Understand, I wanted to see Shavers against Ken Norton. Right? My family in the 70s, we didn't have a VCR. So I was foolish. I was running the streets with my crew. Then I remembered the fight. I ran home. I ran in the living room. My dad had the TV on. I think it was Wide World of Sports or something like that. I sat down. He looked at me and he told me, the fight's over. I was like, what? Then, of course, fortunately, I saw the instant replay. Ernie Shavers just walked through Ken Norton. Right? There's an open question on who was the hardest puncher of the 1970s. Right? I think it's George Foreman. But just understand, I can't argue with the Ernie Shavers crowd. That's how hard Ernie hit. And understand, George Foreman was physically bigger than Ernie. Right? Shavers is that prototypical guy who was just born with a heavy punch. Right? He wasn't the biggest guy. Let me say, too, other guys. Ron Lyle knocks down George Foreman twice. Right? The fight, by the way, that Rich the Fight historian has, folks, it's a gem, is Ron Lyle against Ernie Shavers. And just understand, looking at this film, you will see the power that Ernie Shavers had. Right? Other guys from the era, Oscar Bonavina. Right? There's even a Ghost, a Mockingbird from the era. The Olympics were owned, at least the super heavyweight division, by Teofimo Stevenson. Right? Teofilo Stevenson. And there were many people in the 70s, in different years, who wanted Teofilo Stevenson to fight the heavyweight champ. Right? Stevenson was so dominant in the Olympics. I believe he wins 3 Olympic gold medals or something like that. That, there was serious talk about who would win if, let's say, an Ali fought him. Right? Well, let me just say, and of course you have the heir apparent, Larry Holmes. Right? Well, let me just say that the fight in my favorites folder is a must watch. Right? 5,000 people. The fight was not televised. The guys were fighting for the right to fight George Foreman, who was not the champion. Right? Foreman had lost his title to Ali, who, of course, did not give George a rematch. Right? Ali understood the gimmick of roping a dope wasn't going to work in a rematch. Right? So George Foreman continues his career. Understand, Ron Lyle had already fought Ali. Ernie Shavers comes to town. Right? Now, I'm not saying that Ron Lyle was the most gifted fighter I've seen. But what I am saying is you can sit down and watch a Ron Lyle fight against Joe Bugner. That's must watch. And man, it is so rough and tumble that by the 7th or 8th round, you're going to ask yourself a simple question. How the hell are these guys surviving? You don't even know. By the way, Joe Bugner from the 70s. Tough. Could hang in any era. Any era. Right? Well, let me just say, in this fight, there are ebbs and flows. You'll notice that Shavers only has to be right once. Right? He has Ron Lyle badly hurt. You'll notice, too, that the 70s were a little bit different. Ron Lyle goes over to the ropes. He's not just over by the ropes. No, in the 70s, guys would lean into the ropes. Right? Also, let's just say boxing in the 70s was not for the squeamish. So you're looking at some of the shots Ron Lyle is taking from Ernie Shavers. And there are times where Ron Lyle doesn't look like he'd be able to stand up if he's not leaning on the ropes. And the ref lets the fight continue. Right now there's a regional thing going on. Ron Lyle was from Colorado. This fight's in Denver. Right? Just understand. Colorado had Ron Lyle's back. He's the best fighter of the 70s in the heavyweight division from Colorado. Right? As for Ernie Shavers, I'll just say this. I'm not sure if there's anyone today who hits as hard as Ernie Shavers. Right? Shavers, came close to getting the belt. Right? Has Larry on the floor. Dazed and confused. Just couldn't quite get there. Let me say this too. The 70s had guys who are in the Hall of Fame now. One of the best punchers ever in the light heavyweight division. Bob Foster. And understand, Bob Foster came up to heavy and he fights Joe Frazier. Now, Frazier's a small heavyweight, but Joe Frazier let Bob Foster know, player, this is not the light heavyweight division. Joe walks him down. Joe takes him out. Right? Foster is out of there in like 2 rounds. So undeterred, Foster is back later in the decade in the heavyweight division fighting Muhammad Ali. And of course, in post-fight interviews, Foster would say, hey, Ali couldn't punch. It felt like he was wearing pillows. Of course, Foster doesn't make it the distance against Ali. But that's how rough and tumble the division was, folks. Light heavy's 175. Right? This is akin to Dimitri Bivol saying, hey, Joe Frazier, let's have at it. And then showing up trying to knock out Frazier, because that's what Bob Foster was trying to do. Then showing up later trying to knock out Ali. So all I can say about this Ron Lyle, Earnie Shavers fight is, folks, it's a shootout. Right now, you've heard me here say that the Ron Lyle George Foreman fight was a shootout. Right? I would say the Ron Lyle Joe Bugner fight's a shootout. Folks, this is a shootout. I mean, just understand. For the gamblers out there, you're looking at this fight and you understand early. There is no way this fight's going to go 10 rounds. Right now, you're not even thinking about whether the fight's going to go the distance. You understand. The bullets are flying. Somebody's going to get stopped. Both guys come damn near to getting stopped. Ron Lyle had a punch, but it wasn't quite an Earnie Shavers punch. But he's the one who gets the stoppage. Right? Because he has Earnie fighting at an unsustainable pace. That's the other thing. Right? Today, you have a lot of fighters who look at each other. They're measured. They don't really throw a lot of punches. Right? One guy decides he's not going to fire back. He's going to be defensive. The other guy is throwing punches but doesn't look like he could put them together. Right? Your typical Jarrett Anderson fight. Right? And that's supposed to be a robust fight by today's standards. Right, folks? Please go to my favorites folder right now. Or just type in Rich the Fight Historian. Ron Lyle, Earnie Shavers. Understand, I'm from the 70's. I just saw this film tonight. It's a gem. Earnie Shavers is Earnie Shavers. Ron Lyle is Ron Lyle. You understand, boxing's a craft. But you also understand this is that rare fight where you would not want to have a street fight with either guy. Right? You see Earnie Shavers' punching power, then you think about what Larry Holmes has to say about Ali deteriorating after the Earnie Shavers fight, right? Ali, by the time he gets to Leon Spinks, no longer exists. Just food for thought. But just understand, the punching power was just outsized. Right? It's kind of like, you see some punchers. Foreman, Nigel Benn, Thomas the Hitman Hearns, and you understand, if the guy just hits you the right way, you can be a Roberto Duran, who Hearns iced in 2 rounds. Right? If Hearns hit you the right way, the fight was over. Right? Earnie Shavers has that kind of punching power. Somehow, Ron Lyle, who gets caught in a corner and hammered by Shavers, as only Ron Lyle can, is able to weather the storm and then close the show in the 6th round. Right? This is a 5-star fight. Understand, neither Lyle nor Shavers ever wins the heavyweight title. Understand what the heavyweight title meant in the 70's, and understand what being an elite fighter meant in the 70's. Right? Ali fought both men. Right? Foreman fought Ron Lyle, got dropped twice. Right? You understand? You understand These guys were rough and tumble. In the 70s, if you caught one of these guys on the wrong night, you could be embarrassed. Understand, when Ali fights Oscar Bonavena, right? This is after Bonavena has dropped Joe Frazier twice in a fight. Bonavina's hanging around until, the end of the fight, right before the end of the fight. And Ali is so pissed that Ali doesn't go to a neutral corner. When, the ref tells him to, Ali follows the ref over to him. The ending shouldn't have counted. Right? Ali, then ices Bonavena. The point, though, is Bonavena's hanging around. In other words, you might hear stories about Bonavena at a brothel and all this other stuff. Just understand, in the 70s, these guys were real fighters. Give it a look. I consider the 70s to have the second best heavyweight division I've ever seen. We're here in real time in 2025. I hope people have the common sense to appreciate this heavyweight class. I hope they realize that a Zhilei Zhang could lose to a Kabayel. You don't want to get hit by Zhilei Zhang. Right? Not everyone in the heavyweight division has the body attack of a Kabayel. Right? If you're fighting Zhilei Zhang and you're not bold enough to go deep in the pocket and to, try to take out his body, right? Good luck getting him out of there. Right? I mentioned, too, that Dillian Whyte beat Joe Parker in the past. Right? Joe Joyce beat Parker and Daniel Dubois. Right? The championship, in my opinion, is going to change hands a few times in the coming years. And let me point out that you have a stealth group right now in the heavyweight division who don't have the full resume. Right, folks? If you cannot get by Lawrence Okole's jab, you're going to lose the fight. Right? I don't care who you are. Okolie has a great jab. He's up at heavyweight. He doesn't even have to flash that right hand behind it. Right? All he has to do is batter you with that jab for 4 or 5 rounds. Have you get desperate, then as you leap in the pocket, then he can flash his real power. Right? You have some sleepers right now in heavyweight. Kabayel, in my favorites folder, if you dig deep enough, he beat Derek Chisora. Right? This is a guy who's feasting on hyper-aggressive fighters. Right? Makhmudov is front foot. Right? Here you have Kabayel, and he's using the aggression of a Zhilei Zhang, of a Makhmudov, against them. Right? And understand, another sleeper, I know Makhmudov took out Frank Sanchez. Folks, Sanchez remains the best mover in the heavyweight division right now. Right? Kabayel might just be that guy who upsets the apple cart, taking gamblers' eyes off of the real talent he's beating. Right? As I said, Zhilei Zhang still dangerous. Martin Bakole still dangerous. In fact, Bakole's next fight, I hope people understand that Efe Ajagba has one of the best punches in the heavyweight division. Right? Understand, with a puncher, you can outbox him. I'll agree. Ajagba's a bit wooden. You can outbox him. But understand, if it's a championship fight, that's 12 rounds. Are you going to avoid Ajagba's straight right hand for 12 rounds? Right? Do you feel comfortable picking anybody to avoid Deontay Wilder's straight right hand for 12 rounds? Right? I'll agree. Wilder's lost some fights. To beat Wilder, How many times did Tyson Fury have to get off the canvas? Right? I believe the answer is 4 times. Right? So just understand, this is a blessed heavyweight division. For me, the only historical analog is the 1970s. Right? You know, I hear Lennox Lewis talk about the 90s. Some of those guys are underrated. There's no question about that. Ray Mercer, very tough, right? Understand the 70s met the 90s, right? Larry Holmes fights Ray Mercer when Holmes is well past his prime. Look up Ray Mercer's first loss as a professional, right? The guys in the 70s had different skill sets. You're going to notice, and it's shocking, you're going to notice that Ron Lyle, of all people, comes out against Ernie Shavers and he's dancing. He's he's up on his toes. When I think of Ron Lyle, I'm thinking rough and tumble. I'm thinking pocket. I'm thinking some guy who is ready to trade. He's on his toes. Right? In the 70s, you understood, I need to learn how to be on my toes. Even Ernie Shavers is trying to be on his toes at times in the fight. Right? You don't quite have that now. Now you have guys with huge punches, and they're physically bigger than the 1970s. But I can't say they're as fluid. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours. Please watch the fight. Please leave comments. If you feel another era deserves people's attention, right? I understand, there's a moment there where, Sonny Liston is coexisting with Floyd Patterson, and there are a bunch of other people, Ingemar Johannesson, Eddie Machen, right? If you want to talk about a different era, don't let me stop you. Right? Please feel free to do so in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.